Okay, I've got 2 o'clock, so I guess we'll go, well, 2 o'clock Eastern, I should say. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. We don't have a moderator for this room, so you're stuck with just me. So I'll go ahead and get started. Hope everybody is enjoying the conference so far. And I wanted to take a moment before I even get into my slide deck here. And I going to trip over myself here a little bit and recognize that I failed to put a sponsor slide in here. But thank you to all our sponsors for this event. I'm sure you're going to hear that a lot today, but truly it would not be possible without them. So be sure to stop by their expo booths and say hello, if nothing else. Don't feel like you have to just be interested in their services, just drop by. I know all of them would love to meet you and say hello and get to know you as a DNN community member. Okay, well, this session is about how to build a mobile app using DNN as the back end. And for those of you that do not know me, I am David Poindexter. I'm the CEO of Envisionative. We are a creative marketing and app development agency located in North Carolina in the US of A. I'm the strategy lead on the DNN leadership team, part of the board of directors for DNN Connect, and co-president of the Southern Fried DNN meetup group. And you may also be familiar with my relatively new YouTube channel for DNN Dave. You can visit dnndave.com and you'll see a little bit more about that during the course of this presentation. There's how to contact me and some of the various open source projects that are under the NV Quick brand out there. Now, I put up there in the top right, Mr. Stroll, that I'm a DNN MVP, but maybe you could answer what that means at some point during this conference in one of your sessions. Okay. If you have not already, I would ask you to go out to my DNN Dave YouTube channel and subscribe. If nothing else, just out of kindness to me, I'm trying to get my subscriptions up, and I'm going to be generating quite a bit more content over the coming days and months and years ahead. So pretty excited about that. Okay, so it looks like this is going to be a self-promo kind of presentation, but I promise you it is not. I'm just leveraging things that I needed to do for DNN Dave as a part of this presentation. We're just going to be using some of the data as a basis for this, and it kind of helped me move things forward a little bit for that new website that just recently launched. I haven't talked a whole lot about it, but feel free to go out there right now. It has all the video content from the YouTube channel just being presented out there, but it's going to grow a little bit more over time. So check that out when you get a chance. And ultimately, I'm going to go ahead and show you what we're going to be seeing in action here in just a little bit, right up front here, so that we know kind of where we're marching towards in this session. The majority of this session is going to be a bit interactive, and I would like to focus on the things that are of interest to you the most when it comes to the possibility of building a mobile app with DNN as the back end. So this is what we're going to be looking at right from the get-go or at the end here to see how the mobile app looks, and it is pulling content from the dnndave.com website. So that's what we're going to be building here. It's like, well, it's already built, but I'm going to be showing you kind of how that works and how you can leverage some of the same tools as well as just understand some of the principles of how this ties together. So what are the components that we really need, or the big pieces to the puzzle here that we need? Well, of course, we need DNN platform. It provides a great framework for a lot of the things that we need for just general website content management, things like that, but also giving us a way to build APIs and house them out there so that outside applications, either other websites or modules within the website or even mobile apps in this case, can talk to, read data from, and post data to. So that is a crucial component of this. Now, in my situation, I leveraged a tool called 2SXC or 2Sexy out there for structured content, but this talk is really not about that. It could really be a custom table if you wanted to out there, and you could build your own API that talks and gets data from that database. And I'm gonna try my best to monitor chat over here, but I'll circle back. If you do have a question throughout all this, if you would help me out a little bit and put it in the Q&A tab of the chat area over here. That way I can kind of quickly see the questions and so forth. So in my case, I chose to build out the website using data within 2Sexy as a structured content solution, but this could easily be open content or live visualizer or just like I said, a custom table where you just want to pull data from and manage it some other way. It could be something like Easy DNN News, for instance. If you had a blog on a website, we've built quite a few mobile apps that we've pulled blog information from a website and surfaced it into the mobile app using that kind of approach as well. So when it comes to how to build the API, what you're going to see for me today is a pretty simple example of how we're just getting information from 2Sexy, but some of the same principles are going to apply. You could just as easily use something like the starter web API project that's out on DNN community on GitHub. And I've got the URL here at the bottom. This is really just a bare bones starter for just building a web API project. If you like to roll your own, or if you have like a custom database that you need to interact with, this is a great way to start with that. And there's a bunch of other tools out there as well. We won't go into too much detail about that, but we can talk about it. Let's see. The other component or big piece to the puzzle for me is what we're using to actually build the mobile app itself. And one of my frameworks of choice for this is Ionic. They've been around quite a while. We're in version 6 at this point, but it's a great framework in that you can build mobile apps using standard web technologies. So HTML, JavaScript, CSS, things that we're familiar with. And it's an easy transition from being a web developer and jumping into something like Ionic because everything is so familiar. You could also leverage frameworks that are JavaScript frameworks within Ionic if you wanted to, but you could also approach it from a very pure perspective as well, in the sense of you could literally build a mobile app using Stencil to generate web components. So it could just be pure web components, but Ionic framework in of itself is really a UI library of pure web components. And in the beginning days, prior to Ionic 4, Ionic was very focused on Angular and leveraging that framework. But ever since version 4 of Ionic, they're pretty agnostic when it comes to frameworks. So if you're a Vue.js person or a React developer, you can just as easily use Ionic to build your mobile app as well. Another component that is a big piece of the puzzle for me is how we're going to interact with the native features of the phone. Now, we're not digging into this too much deeply today on the mobile app you'll see here, because we're really just calling a web API and pulling data back and surfacing it. So we're not really leveraging any native features, and we're just going to be looking at it in the browser. But when it comes to building real world applications, you're probably going to at least have one or two native components that you're willing to interact with. And what we do for this is leverage Capacitor. And this was made by the team at Ionic to actually replace something that you may be familiar with or have heard of in the past with Cordova or PhoneGap. Back in the day, that was really the de facto standard to interact with native features. So it's really, think of it as a layer for your front end, to talk to the native applications without having to actually, or native APIs on either iOS or Android, without you having to write Java or Swift or whatever C plus for that, or Objective C. Sorry, not C plus. So Capacitor is actually more of a modern and optimized way to interact with those native APIs. So if you look at the picture over here on the right, you've got your mobile app at the top, but under that you've got your just pure HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And then Capacitor sits in between that and the native libraries of iOS and Android, and as well as PWAs. So Ionic, you can actually easily deploy your application from the same code base as a PWA, progressive web app. Okay, so enough about the fluff. Let's jump in and see some code. And I'm going to glance over here at the chat to see if there's any questions. I don't see any questions at this point. I'm sure you're going to be having lots of them once we jump into the code. So let's go and look at a couple of pieces before we see too much code. So the basis of the data that we've got in this case, and I probably should refresh this, make sure I'm still logged in. Nope, I am not logged in. Let me log in. So this is dnndave.com. I'm going to log in as a super user, but you'll see what I've got here is essentially a list of videos out here. And these all ultimately live on YouTube. So I've got a list view and I've got a detail view here. Each detail view has a way to view it, which just opens up YouTube using a short URL. I've got a title, I've got a date, and I've got a summary section. Now this one's quite kind of interesting. Again, we're not focused too much on this being into sexy, but I'll just kind of show you what a particular video looks like and what the kind of data structure is, if you will. Title, which we'll use in the mobile app. Slug, we will not use necessarily in the mobile app. We've got a date, we've got a summary, we've got a file that's associated with it, and that's the actual thumbnail or the image from YouTube that we just put in there, as well as some rich text for show notes. And then lastly, a YouTube ID. And we use that to construct that URL to YouTube. The related videos is a feature just this web only right now. In the future, the mobile app will probably be able to leverage that as well. But just so you can kind of see what the data structure is there. So if we go back to the list, I probably ought to bring up the time. Oh, I'm only 15 minutes in. That's awesome. Yeah, we're going to have plenty of time to talk about code and stuff. So we've got the list here. It's kind of complicated in the Too Sexy world, just simply because I've got some advanced features here. So I really don't want to go down that rabbit hole unless some of you are just interested in how that works. But I've got paging that works in here. We've got sorting by oldest and newest. And look, Will, you're the oldest video that I've got in the library right now. The oldest two videos. So what does that say? We've been doing this a while. Let's see. So that's really the makeup of all this. I'm going to jump into the actual API portion of this in just a minute, but just to kind of connect the dots here. So we've got our website built in DNN using Too Sexy as structured content. The YouTube channel is out here. That really doesn't come into play in the development of the mobile app, but this is ultimately where my content is being sourced from. So I'm grabbing the video ID. So the mobile app will open the video in the YouTube experience. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit, but that's really the only connectivity, if you will, between this. But we're not really talking to YouTube. We're just kind of opening up in YouTube. So let's take a look at the mobile app. I've got that open in Visual Studio Code over here. Now, what this is, you're going to see a lot of files here and you're going to see a lot of folders. Don't be too overwhelmed by this. In building this, it only took me a few days to build this mobile app. And part of that's because I know how Ionic works, but it's really not hard to get started in Ionic. And I probably should bring those up here real quick. We'll go to ionicframework.com. And to get started with it, you can just go right off the home page here, get started. And oh, that is not what get started does. Let's go to the documentation. Sorry. If you go to the documentation here, and we're looking at version 6 documentation, there's a section here for, you've got two kind of pieces of the puzzle. You've got the Ionic CLI command line interface, but you also have, Ionic, the framework and so forth. So you'll want to install the CLI so that you can run the necessary commands to get this started. And what we've done is we've actually done a starter app. I'm trying to find where that is. Hold on just a minute. Let's see, overview. Here's the installation guide. That's where we were. Probably should have had this pulled up beforehand. But, oh yeah, okay. So they're saying it right here. Okay. So if you do Ionic Start, it'll prompt you of which app type that you want to start with. And there's 3 basic ones, but I think there's some even more options when you run this, but it'll actually prompt you in the command line. So whether you're using PowerShell or command prompt or, some other terminal, bash, it will prompt you for which type of project. In this project, all I did was choose a tabs starter project, and it pretty much scaffolded out everything for me. So it is actually so easy that once you choose your app and put it into a folder, create a starter app, you could actually just go ahead and type Ionic space serve, and it will run the app. So it's pretty, it'll run it in your browser, by the way. It's pretty straightforward and simple. So I'll bring it back full circle. There's a lot of files here that you may or may not understand, a lot of folders that you may or may not understand. If you're familiar with working with NPM, Node Package Manager, you've got a node modules, which kind of holds all of your modules that you're leveraging here. And E2E is for your tests and so forth. A lot of that is really just built out for you right in the starter project, and you may or may not leverage those. And then the top 2 folders here, .angular and .vs Code, are specific to those particular environments. So VS Code, this is your environment stuff. So you're not really going to touch any of this. These top 4 is just not something you're going to touch manually. And then Angular leverages some folder structure for caching with just the framework itself. Now, I chose to build this in Angular because that's where my strength is when it comes to this kind of thing. That's just what I know. But in the end, you're really just working with TypeScript here, and Angular stuff is really kind of how it binds to the front end and all that, and some of the features that you can use for HTTP client, to be able to do the web API calls. You'll see some of that. It's more Angular kind of way of doing things, but the rest of it is just TypeScript. So the focus of the app itself is the source folder and the resources folder. Resources just has 2 files in it. That's your app icon and your splash screen. So I have made those to spec based off of, just what they recommend from Ionic to make those a particular size. And then the rest of it is in the source folder. Now, I think the basic starter app comes with like 3 tabs at the bottom of it. And it just gave me a structure already to go and change those. So under your source folder, you've got an app folder, and these are where most of your pages are. This is really kind of where your Angular app lives. Well, it's not kind of, it is where your Angular app lives. And There are some folders outside of that just for environmental configuration. You may want to run and connect to things a little differently locally than you might for production. So you can have a environment variables set up for production and for local development. There's a theming mechanism in Ionic, and this is all SAS based and CSS variable based. So you'll see in here that there's kind of some root variables that are set. And this is kind of, for those of you familiar with working with other CSS frameworks and so forth, this is not really a framework, this is more CSS variables, but you've got colors that are related to primary, secondary color, and some tertiary color. You've got your success, you've got your warning, you've got your danger, and some medium and light. Now, one thing that comes out of the box with Ionic as well is that you can detect the preference for your device on whether or not it's using a light or a dark theme. And I changed things so that it would default to dark unless the user has a preference set. I'll show you a little bit later how that can kind of just switch. So some work was actually done here, just picking out the right colors for the scheme that I wanted to use. But pretty much all of that is straightforward. Let's see. Jump back over to the app section. So the way this is set up is this is kind of your root starting point, if you will, of the app, as well as your routing for it. We won't dig into that too much, but you got your tabs page. And you'll see that you'll see if any of you went to Daniel Velatis's session earlier today, where he was talking about web components, these are custom elements that are in Ionic framework. So when you see Ion tabs and Ion -tab -bar, all of these are custom elements and they're pure custom elements. So these are just web components that we're leveraging here. And so it's pretty straightforward, but there's 3 tabs set up: home, videos, and resources. And from there, we just build out our pages and our services. Now I've got one service set up here. This is probably a good place for us to start. See, before we jump into that too far, let's go ahead and run it. So I told you that you could just run Ionic serve right from the get-go when you create the app, and it'll serve. Well, I've already kind of built out the app here, and I'm happy to go through any details of how I've built it out. And it's also open source, so you'll see that at the end, where you can get all of the code for this and dig deeper. But we'll run Ionic serve, and we will see in the browser the app running. Now, you may say, well, I thought we were building a mobile app. Well, it is a mobile app. But since it's using HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, we can run it in the browser locally. Obviously, if we were doing native features, that's not going to work, because we're not using a mobile device. So there's some limitations when it comes to running it in your browser, but this is the PWA kind of experience of this. Now I'm going to close this tab because I already have it opened up over here in inspect, so that we can see it in a mobile view and get a little bit more context here. So the app is running. This is the home page. If I go to videos, I've got a list of videos here in a card kind of style. And we've got a resources page here as well. On the videos, we can actually go to a particular video and it'll go to a detail page. So let's just choose this one here with Daniel Velatis, since he's in the audience here. So I go over here and it's actually pulling in all this data from that. I probably should have chosen one that had a list of links in it. Let me see if I can find one here real quick. Okay, here's one. So notice on this one that the content actually has some links in it and so forth. So we'll kind of circle back on some tricks that we had to do in order to handle that, because when you're grabbing data that's rich in the back end, you want to make sure that you don't have to go through jump through too many hoops to make it look right in the context that you're using it. Because obviously that was designed to, let's look at this. It was designed for this site, right? So we want to make sure that it looks okay over here too. And we were able to do that fairly minimalistic in styling over here to make that work. Okay, so we've got the context of what we're looking at and what we're seeing it do. Let's talk about how it all wires together. So over in the mobile app, we've got a TypeScript file here that is our REST service. Now you could split this up into a bunch of different files and so forth, but this is the pattern that I like to use. Um, for those of you that don't know Angular, don't worry about this too much on kind of how this works, but just understand the kind of the concepts. It would work the same way if you were using React or Vue. You would have your client side, if you will, API that makes a call to the backend API, right? So in this case, we really only have two API calls. I'll highlight them here, and I'll also zoom in a little bit because I know seeing it on these screens are a bit difficult sometimes. Oh, by the way, one tip that somebody told me, that if you want to see just the screen share portion of it and you don't care too much about the video aspect of it, you can click the three dots at the top right of the screen share and make that full screen itself, and that may help you see some of this stuff. Okay, so in Angular, we're using something called HTTP client that allows us to make HTTP requests. And there's a bunch of different verbs that you can use: get and post and put and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so we're leveraging that HTTP client built right into Angular, and we've got two API calls. This is just our method name, and we are treating this as an observable, and that's another concept within Angular. But ultimately, we're just doing a fetch in the end. So this .http.get is under the hood really just a fetch that's happening here. And we are calling the API URL, which I've got configured in my environment file that I mentioned earlier. And so over here, I've got environment.dnn.api URL, and this is my endpoint for the backend API. So take kind of a mental picture of this: API, too sexy, app, basic content API. That's a pretty long path here, but that's just kind of how we have it configured. Basic content is my app name, and API is the endpoint. So we'll jump over and look at that in just a minute. So I'm back over in my REST service. So all we're doing is we got one call that gets all of our videos. So that's our entire list. And then we've got another API call that gets a specific video by ID. Okay. So the list is actually going to have the ID in it, so that when we click on a particular video, it's going to send the ID parameter via the API call to get that detail information for that particular event. Video. So that's how we're doing it in the mobile app. And if we just go to, so I'm under pages here, videos, and we take a peek at the HTML here. So think of this in any kind of tokenized kind of environment. I mean, it's a little more in depth because we're in Angular world, but we're binding the data that we get in our list of videos. We've got a variable, if you will, with video. So if I click on the item in the list, then I'm going to call a method in my TypeScript and pass the ID of the video in there, and that'll allow us to be routed in the mobile app to the detail page, and we'll see how that works. But the rest of this is just data that's being pulled from the return of the API call. So we've got the date, we've got the title, we've got the summary that's being shown in our list over here. So if I look at videos, notice over here on the left, I've got my console open, and this is my network tab. So the get call is actually happening, and you'll see that that's the URL that we were expecting. and it's actually pulling data back here, and I'm actually console logging it so that I can see it. So I've got all my videos coming back, and each video has that set of data that I need for this list. So in the code, we're just binding that in the HTML. Okay, so let's look at the TypeScript behind it. There are a few events. This is kind of the shape of our object. So we've got a model here for our response object that's coming back from the API call. So we'll have a place to store our data. So it consists of paging information, which we don't have to worry about right now, and our list of videos. Each video has an ID, title, date, summary, image, show notes, and so forth. Just exactly what you see in the console log that's coming back, this data here. So it just provides the shape of the data that we expect to get from the API call. So there's our model, and we leverage that model over here. I'm going to not focus too much unless people are interested in this. I'm not going to focus a whole lot on the Ionic-ish things or the Angular things too much, but there are events that are already built into Ionic. One of them is saying that the view is going to enter, it will enter. So Ion view will enter. This is the right event for us to make our API call. This API call is calling our REST service. Okay, so you'll see in the constructor here, I've got our REST service, which is imported from 2 levels up, services, rest.service, which is this. And we make the API call. Well, we make a function call, sorry. And the function is here. And then we're going to wrap our API call in a promise so that we'll wait for all the data to come back before we start working with it. So this .rest.get videos is literally that call over here in the REST service. So if we get data back, then we're going to set our local variable of videos, which is defined here. And it's all initialized, by the way, with just -1s for numbers and empty strings for strings, so that we have an initial state of that complex variable. We're going to set that to data. So data is what's coming back from the API call, because it is an observable of get videos response. Get videos response is in our model here. So we set that to data, and I'm console logging out data, and that is literally what we're seeing right here, data. Okay, so is that clear as mud? That's kind of how it's working. So we set that to our videos variable, and then that allows us in the HTML to let video, this is kind of like a loop, a for loop in Angular. So let video of the list of videos, videos.videos, because that is the shape of our object. So videos. All right, so that gives us our list. Oops, did not mean to jump over to that. And then that way we can bind the date and title and summary to anything that changes in that model to that point. So that's kind of how that works. Let's look. You may be saying, well, okay, this is all great, David, on how to do it in Angular, but you haven't showed me how this is talking to the API and DNN. Well, we looked at how it's making the call, but we didn't look at the actual API. So let's go and take a look at that piece of it. Again, I don't want to focus too much on Too Sexy, but that is my environment here. So what I want to do is let's go back to the home page. I'm going to go into edit mode here. Oh, I didn't need to do that. I'm sorry. Couldn't remember if I had the action available here to see that, but I'm going to go into configuration for the Too Sexy app here. And we went over this a little bit ago, but it's not very complicated. We went over it at a high level, but now you get to see some of the details. All of the videos are part of a content type called video, and that has the various fields that I showed you in the UI for editing it a little bit ago. So that is our content type. And then of course our views, we've got a list view and we've got a detail view. And in my case, those are on 2 different pages. Now, each of these views, you'll notice that it is of a type that data is coming from a query. So I've got queries set up for pulling back the list of videos and then detail for the website and then detail for mobile. There's a slight difference between those two. And we may have time to look at that a little bit later. But let's take a look at this query first. So for those of you that don't know Too Sexy, sorry about this part of it, but I'm trying to kind of connect the dots for those that do understand it. So the view, which is what shows the information on the page, is actually leveraging this query. And all of this is really just a SQL query in the end. We've got an app defined, and that is our, sorry, I didn't mean to click that. Our default data that's coming from this is associated with the content type that's defined in the view. And then we've got a type filter here. We are saying, I want the videos. So this is the content type that's associated with this query. I wanted to sort those on the back end and allow also on the front end via query string to be able to sort those as well as something else, which we'll see in just a minute. But I wanted to set a default of descending. And if sort was in the query string parameter, which I can show you right over here. If I change this, notice that my URL changed to sort equals ASC, which is ascending. And if I do newest, sort descending. But by default, if I visit this page, it's going to be descending. So that is what that piece of it is. And the last piece of it is for paging. And it's a little bit more complex, but it's the same kind of concept. I have some query string parameters, one for page size. And that's why we're only getting 10 right now when we're looking at the mobile app. When it comes back, you'll see only 10 here. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute as well. So you've got page size and the default is 10. And then you've also got the page number or page, and the default of that is 1. So over here, when we're clicking the paging, you'll notice that page equals 3. That takes us to the third page of the list of information. So what does all this have to do with the API? Well, good question. This is tied to the view. Okay, so this is kind of the query that's set up for that particular view. Let me get out of this, go back into here because I closed that window. I didn't mean to. So over in the view, when we're looking at the list, you'll see that this list is configured to use the video list query. Okay. So the view is by default, the default data that's coming into the view is from that query that I just showed you. And then something very similar for the detail. This view is tied to the view detail query. And then I've got one also set up specifically for the mobile app because I needed to do something a little bit different here than I needed to do on the website. So all that's great. That's the kind of the foundation that we're going to use to actually build our web API. So web API is here, and I've created a controller. And in the end, when I go and I look at this, those of you that aren't familiar with Too Sexy, you'll recognize the pattern a little bit anyways. This can be done in regular C# because this in the end is C#. This is just a CS file. And it is located in the API folder, and it's called View Controller. Some of this stuff is specific to Too Sexy in the sense that it leverages some of their namespaces within here, but most of it is not. Most of it is pure. Okay, so you'll notice at the top, this will work on Octane or DNN because Too Sexy supports both now in their hybrid fashion. So these are just getting the namespaces that we need. In our case, we're only using these two namespaces, system.web.http and .NET.web.api, because that is what the controller needs in order to be able to use DNN's web API. And then we're pulling in as well, let's see, system.link. And I am creating something called list or dynamic list, because in the end, the returned object that I am sending back is being dynamically constructed. So that's why we need to use this IEnumerable in generic namespace within system.collections. So this is just a trick within TooSexy to explicitly set your return type to be able to use it as dynamic. The rest of this is really just straightforward. It does implement, it does implement custom.hybrid.api 1, 2, or 12. This is a TooSexy thing to support this. So if you're running this same app on Octane, then it will leverage the two proper namespaces for it. And if it's running in DNN, it'll do this. Everything else is pure C# and DNN specific. Well, I say everything else. Okay, sorry, that's not exactly true. So we've got a method here set up as an HTTP GET, and on the class we defined it as allow anonymous. So we can actually call this without having any authentication on the app. So if you wanted to write a module to consume the data that's out on dnndave.com, you can do that because I've set it to allow anonymous, and it's just a GET. So there's the name of our API. So that maps right over. If I'll flip back over into our code, let's go back to the REST API. So the URL is in our environment here. So let's see, environment. Try to paint the full picture here. So we've got /API/TooSexy. That's the root of the TooSexy API. And then we've got app. And then the name of the app, which is basic content. That's actually literally the name of the app that I'm using in TooSexy. And then API is the folder name that holds the controller. So API controller. So that's how we know the endpoint. And then the name of the actual call is GET. So if we go back over here, I probably should have left that open, is GET. So video/GET. And this is all by convention. You know, the naming of this works just like any other DNN web API piece of it. So you'll notice I've got two blocks here. Well, I've got an optional ID that could be passed in. So I'm using the same endpoint for both getting a list of videos as well as getting the information for an individual video. So connecting the dots there, notice that the endpoint video/GET is the same on both of these. It's just that on the GET video, when I'm passing in an ID, I'm going to append the query string parameter of ID to it. So this is going to take a look at it, and by default, it's going to be -1. So if we don't pass in an ID, then we know that we're going to be in this block of the if. And if we do pass in the ID, we'll be into this. So if this is for the entire list of videos, and if we're getting a specific ID, then we're going to pull back a specific detail information. So let's take a look at the list first. So remember I showed you the query that was set up in TooSexy. Literally the name of it was video list. So this is a TooSexy feature here where you can access, I'm just defining a variable that says, okay, define my query as video list. And then I want the default data from this. Don't worry about this too much. It's just a TooSexy thing. And then I want to create a variable that explicitly sets that data as a list. so that we can enumerate that list. And then these two are for paging. We're going to ignore those for right now, but it's done the same way, where the query is paging and we're setting that up as a list as well. So once I have this, I actually have the data at this point in the controller. So we're going to just return the information at that point because I've got it in videos. So I'm going to return a new object that is of the shape that I have set up as my model over here. So I want to make sure that it follows this shape with these and this. So we'll come back into here. You'll notice that I've got the ID and I'm just setting it to, this is just a link statement here to where we're selecting from videos where, let's see, ID equals video dot entity ID. That is literally the ID that is in Too Sexy for that content item. And then I've got video.title, video.date, and I had to convert that to a specific format that I wanted it for string to send back. And then we've got summary going back, we've got image going back, and we've got YouTube ID. And we're going to ignore paging for right now. So jumping back over into the, over here, if we take a look at our, I'm in the wrong place, mobile app. Okay, over here, this is exactly what's coming back. So everybody follow me so good? I mean, so far? It's so good. Okay. And I think we've got about 15 more minutes. So I want to make sure we have time for questions. So that's the, that's the API there. If we're doing a individual one, then good. This one is using the query for the mobile. And I'll go ahead and show you what I was doing differently there real quick. Reason I needed that to be different. So on the website, we've got it coming back and I've got it filtered by video. And I've got another filter on it for some other pieces of it, like episode. Because the reason this was made like this is because when you click on a detail or click on any one of these and go to the detail view, notice that I have to put episode and I have to put the slug in here. This is to make it more SEO friendly. I didn't need to do that for the mobile app. So therefore I did something different for that one because I didn't need that filter on it. So I'm going to come back in here. I probably should quit clicking around so much like that. We'll get back in here. Go to query. And for the mobile, I didn't need to do that. I just needed to put a filter on it for the content type that we wanted and a filter on it for just the ID, because that was all that I was passing back to the API is the ID. And we needed to read that in the query string, whereas on the website, we didn't need to do that. So that's why there are two different queries set up for this one. So back to here, we're in the else block here where we're pulling back one video. We set the app query to video detail mobile. And then I'm reading from the query string. This is a Too Sexy method here, by the way, on this, that reads the ID from the query string and makes it a string here so we can work with it. And then the other two, let's see, this is just like we did up here. We set a default to our default data from that. And then video as dynamic, because in this case, we're not doing a list. We're doing a dynamic that's coming back, or it's coming back as or we want to send it back as a dynamic, and we're going to grab the first item in the list from this. So there's other ways that this could be done on this, but this is the way I chose to do it, just to grab it as the first item that comes back. And then it's really making sure that the shape of this is the same shape as we expected or expect to see in our model for the details. So I haven't showed you that one yet. So I've got video under the videos folder. And here we've got a model set up for the get video response. So the shape of this needs to match in your API, the shape of this. So that's it for that. And be sure to post any of your questions at this point. I'm sure you're loaded with questions, but I don't see any showing up over on the Q&A. So be sure to put those in there if you have them, and I'll be happy to kind of tailor what I'm talking about to your questions. So that's kind of it, full circle of how this is all connected and working with each other. So over in the mobile app, let me collapse this down or clear this out. We'll refresh this videos page. We noticed that the get, let me just filter that. Yep, that is already filtered. So we got a get here that just happened, and we got a successful response. This is what came back from it. And I'm also console logging it here. So that's our list of 10 videos. Now you may be thinking to yourself, well, okay, you got the first 10, but what about the rest of them? So that is yet to be done. And what we're going to use in this, actually, let me just circle back to that and I'll answer it, but don't let me forget to answer that one. So that's our list. And then we click on a detail. We see the response being console logged out here, but we see the get call with the ID equal to 847, which is the entity ID into Sexy, which I knew from up here because I clicked on the first one, which is 847, right? That's the data that comes back from that. So we made that call, got a 200, which is a successful response. And notice that our payload was ID of 847, and it was done as a query string parameter. So it is working the way that we would expect. And then we just wire that up to the front end or bind it to the front end. And notice the play button here. I'll show you that code real quick. In the HTML, all we're doing is we've done a floating action button, I think is what that's for, FAB, and it popular pattern, especially on Android, floating right now at the bottom, but it's really just going to be an href that opens in a new window. And interestingly enough, the way that this works in Ionic is that, if I was on a iOS device and I had the YouTube app installed, it would automatically just kind of know to open that up. Worst case scenario, it's going to open in your browser, and your browser will detect that you have, in the operating system, it will detect whether or not you have the app or not. And sometimes it will prompt you to open in the app or to continue in the browser. So that's kind of how that's fired up. So if we were to click this, then we see the YouTube video. Hello. So one other thing that I wanted to touch on, and then I'll circle back to the 10 items only coming back. Notice that the summary that's coming back is actually HTML. So we have to make sure that we're styling that appropriately, because one of the problems that I had based on the color theme that I was using on this, the links were being, they were disappearing essentially because the blue that is by default shown in the browser, and it would look a little bit differently on your mobile devices, but it wasn't going to look the way I wanted it to look. So I had to figure out how to style any A tags that were coming back or anchor tags that were coming back to look okay in the theme. So I went ahead and did some styling within here to style those. And I chose to do those in a global fashion. And in Ionic, you can do that through something like, app defaults. Ultimately, everything gets loaded by this global SAS file. And in this case, I just created another file because it was kind of part of the theme, in my opinion. So I just created a SAS file called app-defaults. And here I've done a few styling things that I needed to do across the entire app. So in this case, I wanted to make sure that A tags, both for iOS and for Android, MD is for material design. Another beautiful thing that you can do in Ionic, it gives you, or OS specific classes that you can leverage. So here, I just wanted to make sure that the background color was transparent and that I was using a color that I'd already defined as a CSS variable in my theme and gave a fallback color as well. So now we get, these nice colors that are shown here. So I think I got about 5 minutes left. So let me talk a little bit about the next steps for the app. I may have mentioned that it was already open source and out on GitHub. So if you go out to GitHub, it's under the Envisionative org, and it's DNN-Dave-mobile-app. And you can go out here and get all the source code. I haven't taken the time yet to put a proper README in place or anything like that, but you can clone this repo and run it locally, and it should just work for you. Following, you just clone this repo. You'd probably want to run npm install in your command prompt so that it would install all your local node modules in that. And also from there, you can just run Ionic space serve, and it will serve up that in the browser just like we're looking at here. So I mentioned that it was only pulling back 10 articles in the list here by default. Oops, I'm on the wrong page. Okay, so here it's only pulling back 10. I'm on a detail. Sorry. Okay, so here it's only pulling back 10 by default right now. So what I'm planning on doing is using something called infinite scroll inside of the Ionic framework, that once the user starts scrolling down and they get close to the end of the list, it's kind of a lazy loading experience. It'll actually call or recall the API to get the next 10 and so forth. And I may change it from just getting 10 to a little bit more than that, because it's not real heavy calls that, or a lot of data that's coming back. So I went ahead and created an issue out here to track this. And if you have other ideas for the app, feel free to let me know there. If you find bugs or anything, look forward to seeing the app evolve a bit on this, and want to make sure that this is a good resource for the community. So what questions do you have? Let's see over here in the chat. What about authentication? Okay, so in the case that you need authentication, you can leverage JWT, which is built into DNN. By default, it's not installed as an auth provider, but you can install JWT. I think it came about in 8.0.0. So anything from 8.0.0 above, you can go into extensions, available extensions, and go to, I can't remember if it's in I think it's in providers. Yep, there it is. So in providers, you can install this DNN JWT auth handler, and that will give you the ability to use JWT, JSON Web Tokens, for your authentication. We've done this a lot. So if you have more detailed questions about how to do that, feel free to reach out. But it's well documented also out on DNN Docs. And sorry, Will Straw, I'm typing dnndocs.com because I don't want to type that long URL there, but it still routes over there. So out here, if you go to, I believe it's under the tutorials actually, and then search JWT over here, you'll see all sorts of documentation here about how this works in DNN and how you can leverage it. And it works like a charm from mobile apps. We've written quite a few of them that leverage JWT and be able to authenticate for various features against your API. Okay, any other questions? Well, awesome. Thank you everyone for attending this session. We're right at the hour here. So Feel free to ping me up either privately through a message or in any of the chats here, or reach out to me on the DNN community Slack, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or do a deeper dive session with you after the conference. But thanks, everybody. Oh, and I was hoping it didn't make anybody feel like this and made them feel like this. And okay, I got to get through all my slides. All right, have a great conference, everybody.